The morning Wren Calloway aged out of foster care, nobody threw her a party. A caseworker handed her a thin manila envelope across a county desk, gave her a practiced, sympathetic smile, and that was it. 18 years old, legally an adult, completely alone. Inside that envelope was a prepaid card with barely enough to eat for a week, and a deed to a dead apple orchard in western Colorado, land left to her by Marlene Calloway, the grandmother who, for 12 long years, Wren believed had simply thrown her away. She'd barely stepped off the bus in Cedar Bluff when her phone rang. A smooth, easy voice offered her $15,000 for the property sight unseen. "The land's dead, sweetheart," the man said. "We'd be doing you a favor," to a girl who'd been sleeping in a group home a week earlier. $15,000 sounded like a whole new life, but something stopped her from saying yes. Because Wren didn't know yet that beneath the rotting floorboards of that abandoned farmhouse, her grandmother had hidden a secret worth far more than $15,000. A secret a billion-dollar company would burn the whole orchard down to keep buried, and she had no idea the woman who abandoned her had been protecting her all along. The morning Wren Calloway aged out of the foster care system, the Colorado sky was the kind of blue that looked painted on. Hard, cloudless, indifferent. The sort of sky that didn't care one way or the other what happened to a girl standing alone on the steps of a county building with everything she owned slung over one shoulder. There was no party, no cake, no balloons, just a fluorescent-lit lobby that smelled faintly of floor wax and old coffee, and a caseworker named Donna, who had done this so many times that her sympathy had worn down to something smooth and automatic, like a coin rubbed featureless in a pocket. Donna handed Wren a thin manila envelope across the front desk. She smiled the way people smile at funerals. Then she shook Wren's hand, told her to take care of herself, and turned back to her computer. Before the girl had even reached the door, 18 years old, legally an adult, and in the span of a single handshake, completely officially alone. Outside, the air hit her like the breath of an oven. Dry pavement, diesel exhaust, the high desert sun baking the concrete steps until the heat came up through the soles of her shoes. Wren stood there a moment, the envelope clutched against her chest, feeling something she had no name for, exposed and invisible at the same time. A girl no one was looking at, who had nowhere in the world she was supposed to be. She opened the envelope right there on the steps, because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. Inside was a copy of her birth certificate, her social security card, a prepaid debit card with a balance so small it made her stomach drop, and a single folded document, heavy paper, an official seal pressed into the bottom corner. A deed. Wren read it twice before the words stopped sliding off her brain. A property, acreage. An orchard, it said, with a farmhouse and outbuildings located outside a town called Cedar Bluff in the western part of the state. And a name on the line above hers, the name of the person who had left it to her, Marlene Calloway, her grandmother, the woman Wren had spent 12 years learning to hate. For a long moment, she just stared at that name, and the heat rose around her, and the traffic moved past, and somewhere a truck downshifted with a sound like a growl. 12 years. She had been 6 the last time she saw that woman's face. 6 years old, and then a car, and then a different house, and then another, and another. And the slow hardening of a child who learns that the people who are supposed to keep you don't always keep you. Her grandmother had let them take her, had signed the papers, had walked away. And now, somehow, from beyond the grave, she was reaching back, handing Wren a piece of dirt in the middle of nowhere, as if a dead orchard could undo 12 years of empty birthdays and other people's dinner tables. and the particular loneliness of being a thing the system passed from hand to hand. Wren folded the deed and put it back in the envelope. She told herself she felt nothing. She was good at telling herself that. She'd had practice. Her phone buzzed before noon. She almost didn't answer. The number was unknown, and unknown numbers in her experience meant either a bill collector or a wrong number. But she was sitting on a bench at the bus station by then, watching the departures board flip through its destinations, and she had nothing else to do. So she answered. The voice on the other end was smooth, easy, the kind of voice that had been trained somewhere to sound like a friend you'd known for years. "Is this Wren Calloway?" She said it was. The man introduced himself. "Dalton Reese," he said, "a land acquisitions officer with a company called Meridian Agri-Science." He was sorry to hear about her grandmother's passing. He hoped he wasn't catching her at a bad time. He had the warmth of a man holding a door open for you, and somewhere underneath it, so faint you'd miss it, if you weren't listening, the patience of a man who had done this many times and knew exactly how it ended. "We've been keeping an eye on the Calloway property for some time," he said. "And now that it's passed to you, we'd like to make you an offer. A generous one. $15,000 cash for the whole parcel." Wren's breath caught. $15,000. A week ago, she'd been sleeping in a shared room in a group home, listening to another girl cry through the wall. $15,000 was a car. It was first and last month's rent on an apartment with a door that locked. It was a year of community college. It was a future handed to her over the phone by a stranger with a kind voice. And all she had to do was say one word. "The land's not what it used to be." Dalton Reese went on, gentle now, almost apologetic. "I'll be honest with you, Wren. That orchard's gone. The trees are dead. The soil's spent, the well's probably dry. It's a hard truth, but it's the truth. There's nothing out there for you but heartache and back taxes. We'd be doing you a favor, really. Taking it off your hands." She opened her mouth to say yes, and something stopped her. She would think about that moment for the rest of her life. The moment she didn't say yes. She couldn't have told you what it was. Maybe it was the word favor, the way it landed just a little too soft, the way a salesman softens a word he's used 1,000 times. Maybe it was the kindness, which was a beat too quick, too ready, too smooth. Maybe it was just the stubbornness she'd carried since she was small, the same stubbornness that had kept her alive in places that would have broken a softer kid. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe she just needed for once in her life to see a thing with her own eyes, before someone else told her what it was worth. "I'm not selling," she heard herself say. "Not until I've seen it." There was a pause on the line. It was brief, less than a second. But Wren heard it, and there was something in it she didn't like. It wasn't the pause of a disappointed man. It was the pause of a man recalculating. A man who had expected one road, and now had to find another. "Of course," Dalton Reese said, and the warmth slid right back into place, seamless. "Take all the time you need. Go see it for yourself." But Wren, a small chuckle, friendly. "Offers like this don't sit forever. You understand." She understood. She ended the call and sat there a long while, watching her own reflection ghost across the dark glass of the station window. Then she got up, walked to the counter, and spent a portion of the little money she had on a one-way ticket west. For the first time in her entire life, she wasn't being placed somewhere. She was choosing. The bus left the city behind in stages. First the suburbs, then the strip malls, then the long open stretches where the mountains stood up blue and distant on the horizon, and the land between went brown and gold and empty. Wren pressed her forehead to the window and watched it all roll by, and somewhere in those long, quiet miles, against her own better judgment, She let herself try to remember. She remembered very little. She'd been 6. Memory at 6 is mostly smell and color, and feeling, not fact. She remembered the smell of apple blossoms, sweet and clean, so thick in the spring air that you could almost taste it. She remembered green, rows and rows of green leaves so thick the sunlight came through them gold and dappled, and the grass between the trees so tall it brushed her knees when she ran. She remembered a pair of hands, rough hands, strong weathered dirt under the nails, hands that had lifted her up onto a hip and held her there, while a low voice said something she couldn't recall the words of, only the warmth of it. And then she remembered the part she'd spent 12 years trying not to remember. The car, the stranger in the front seat, looking back through the rear window as the farmhouse got smaller and smaller, and that woman standing on the porch, not running, not chasing, not fighting, just standing there, letting her go. If she loved me. Wren thought the way she'd thought it 1,000 times. Why didn't she fight? And if she didn't love me, why leave me anything at all? She had no answer. She had never had an answer. She watched the mountains and let the question sit in her chest like a stone she'd long ago stopped trying to lift out. The bus dropped her at a sun-bleached stop on the edge of Cedar Bluff a little after noon the next day. She stepped down into the heat, stiff and gritty-eyed, and stood there while the bus pulled away in a cloud of diesel. And then it was quiet. Cedar Bluff was the kind of town that small western towns have always been. Stubborn, faded, holding on by its fingernails. A feed store with a peeling sign. A diner with a hand-lettered board out front promising green chili and pie. Pickup trucks angled in along the main street like they'd been parked there since before she was born. A church. A bank. A bar. The kind of town a man could drive through in 90 seconds and never think about again. And the kind of town a man could spend his whole life in and never want to leave. Wren went into the feed store because it was the only place that looked open, and asked the man behind the counter if he knew the Callaway place. He was old, 70, maybe more. Suspenders of face like cracked leather eyes that had been squinting into this same sun for half a century. He looked at her for a long moment before he answered, and something moved behind those eyes that she couldn't read. "The Callaway orchard," he said slowly. "Out past the irrigation district. 12 miles, give or take." He set down the box he'd been holding. "Thought nobody owned that place anymore." "I do," Wren said. "Now." The old man looked at her harder then, at her face, and something softened or maybe sharpened, she couldn't tell. "You'd be Marlene's girl," he said. It wasn't a question. Wren felt her jaw tighten. "Granddaughter." The old man nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he'd already half decided. He told her how to get there, drew her a little map on the back of a receipt. The roads and the turns and the cattle guard she'd cross. And then, as she was turning to go, he said one more thing, quiet almost to himself. "Your grandmother," he said. "Folks around here never did understand her, but she was the most determined woman I ever knew." That word. Determined. Wren turned it over as she walked back out into the heat. It didn't fit the woman she'd built in her head, the woman who'd stood on a porch and let her go. Determined women fought. Determined women didn't sign their grandchildren away. She didn't have a car. She had her own 2 feet and 12 miles of high desert road. But a kid from the system learns to make her own way. And after an hour of walking with her thumb out a rancher and a battered Ford, slowed down, looked her over and jerked his head at the passenger seat. He didn't say much, neither did she. He led her off at the mouth of a long dirt drive and pointed up it with one finger. And then he was gone in a plume of dust. And Wren stood there, in the enormous afternoon silence, looking up the road toward the place her grandmother had left her. She walked. The first thing she noticed was the sound, or rather the absence of it. No hum of irrigation, no rustle of healthy leaves, just the wind pushing through dry branches with a hollow rattling sound, a sound like something old and brittle being turned over in its sleep. Then she came over a low rise and saw it, and she stopped. The farmhouse leaned. Not much, but enough that the eye caught it and couldn't let it go. Its white paint had long since surrendered to the sun, gone gray and chalky and flaking. The porch steps sagged in the middle like a tired back. A barn stood off to one side, its great door hanging crooked from a single hinge, gaping open onto darkness. And beyond the house, stretching back toward the foothills in long, uneven rows, was the orchard, if you could still call it that. It looked less like rows of trees than like rows of graves. Gnarled black trunks, brittle limbs clawing at the sky, bark split open by years of drought, peeling back to reveal the dead gray wood underneath. Here and there a branch had fallen, and lay where it landed, slowly turning to dust. There was not one green leaf in the whole of it, not one. This was it. This was what 12 years of silence had bought her. Wren walked down between two of the rows, her boots crunching over soil, so hard and dry it had cracked into a mosaic of little plates. She crouched and pressed her palm flat against the ground, the way you might touch the forehead of someone sick. And the earth was hot and hard, and it gave back nothing. It felt like it had forgotten a long time ago how to be soft. A bitter laugh came out of her before she could stop it. $15,000. Suddenly, it sounded like a fortune. Suddenly, Dalton Reese sounded like the only honest man she'd met all week. The land's gone. We'd be doing you a favor. He'd been right. Anybody with eyes could see he'd been right. She walked the rows anyway. She didn't know why. Maybe just to make herself believe it, to grind the truth in. She walked down what had once been the center aisle, and she tried the way you can't help trying to lay the green memory of a 6-year-old over the dead thing in front of her. She remembered grass to her knees. There was no grass now, only dust. She remembered sunlight coming through thick leaves. There were no leaves now, only the bare scratch of dead twigs against her sleeve as she passed, dry and sharp as small bones. "She left me this," Wren said out loud, and her voice sounded strange in all that silence. The anger came up then, sharp and familiar. The old, reliable anger that had kept her company for 12 years. Maybe the company had been right. Maybe the land really wasn't worth saving. Maybe Marlene Calloway had run out of money and run out of luck and run out of love all at once, and this dead orchard was just the proof of a life that had quietly fallen apart while a little girl grew up somewhere else, learning to stop expecting anyone to come. She went up to the house as the sun started to slide. The front door wasn't locked. It opened with a groan and she stepped into a kitchen that hadn't changed in years. Dust lay over everything in a thin, patient gray skin. The sink was bone dry, a single cup left in it, ringed with the ghost of old coffee. The refrigerator door hung open onto a dark, empty interior. On the wall by the back door, a calendar still hung, turned to a month 9 years gone. Its pages curled at the corners like something trying to fold itself away. There was a small wooden table and 2 chairs. Wren pulled out one of the chairs and sat, and the table wobbled under the weight of her arms. She tried to picture the woman who had lived here, alone. An old woman alone in a leaning house at the end of a 12-mile dirt road, with winter storms rolling down out of the mountains and the bills stacking up on this very table, and the silence pressing in year after year, until one day the silence won. If she loved me. Wren thought again, why didn't she come back? Why didn't she write? Why didn't she pick up a phone in 12 whole years even once? In the emptiness of that kitchen with the light going amber and the dust hanging in the slanted sun, the old question hit harder than it ever had. And the only answer the empty house gave her was the wind moving through the dead orchard outside, low and restless, like something out there refusing to lie still. Night came down fast and cold the way it does in high country. The heat of the day fled all at once, and the desert chill came in behind it. And Wren found a lantern in a cupboard, a little battery camping lantern, and switched it on and carried it out onto the sagging porch. She sat on the steps with her arms wrapped around her knees and looked out at the dead orchard under a sky so thick with stars. It didn't look real. She took out her phone. There was barely any signal, but there was enough to show her the missed call from Meridian Dalton Reese's number, sitting there like a door left open. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow morning, I'll call him. I'll take the $15,000. I'll sign whatever there is to sign, and I'll get back on that bus. And I'll leave this dry, broken, God-forsaken place behind, and I'll never think about it again. She believed it too. She fell asleep on the lumpy couch inside, believing it, the lantern burning low, the wind working through the orchard all night long, patient and restless like something that had been waiting a very long time and could wait a little longer. She woke before dawn, stiff and cold, and for a moment she didn't know where she was. Then she remembered, and she lay there in the gray pre-light and listened to the silence, and she half wanted to just get up and start walking back to town that minute. But she didn't. She made herself wait for the light, and when the light came, it came gentle, pale gold spilling slow across the orchard from behind the foothills. And for a few minutes it did something almost cruel. It softened the dead branches. It gilded the gnarled trunks. It made the whole ruined place look, just for a moment from a distance, in the kindest light of the day, almost alive. For one foolish second, Wren let herself wonder if she'd exaggerated it all in her head. If maybe in the morning light it wasn't so bad. It was that bad. By the time the sun cleared the hills and the heat began to climb, the illusion was gone and the orchard was just dead again. She made herself busy while she worked up the nerve to make the call. She opened cabinets more out of restlessness than any purpose. Most were empty. A few held old canning jars, clean and dust-filmed, a rusted can opener, a stack of yellowed seed catalogs, their pages soft as cloth. Ordinary things, the leftovers of an ordinary, lonely life. She told herself she was just killing time, just looking, just putting off the moment when she'd say yes to Dalton Reese and turn this whole strange chapter into something behind her. And that was when the heel of her boot caught on a loose board near the sink. It shifted under her weight with a sound that stopped her cold. Not the dull thud of wood on dirt, a hollow sound, a metallic sound, the sound of something underneath. Wren stood very still. Then she crouched down. The board was warped, lifted slightly at one end. She worked her fingers into the gap and pried, and it came up easier than it should have, as if it had been lifted many times before. She set it aside and looked down into the dark. It wasn't dirt under there. It was iron. A hatch. A narrow iron hatch set flush into a concrete floor, dusty but solid, with a recessed handle lying flat, so that nothing would catch the eye of anyone walking across the kitchen. It had been built to stay hidden. Someone had wanted it to stay hidden. Her heart was going now hard and fast, and she didn't entirely understand why. She told herself it was nothing, a root cellar, a storm shelter. Every old farmhouse out here had a hole in the ground for one reason or another. She gripped the handle and pulled. It resisted. Then it gave with a dry groan of metal, and a breath of cool air rose up out of the dark and touched her face. It smelled of earth and concrete and something faintly chemical, something clean, something that didn't belong in a root cellar at all. A ladder went down into the dark. Wren turned on her phone's flashlight, swung her legs over the edge and started down. The rungs were cold under her hands. The dark swallowed the little light. She went down 10 feet 12 and her flashlight beam swung across the space below. And she stopped halfway down the ladder, 1 foot in the air. Because what she'd expected was a root cellar. And what she was looking at was a laboratory. It wasn't a hole in the ground. It was a room. A real room, walled and floored in concrete, the air dry and cool and still. And it was not chaos, it was order. Beautiful, meticulous, fanatical order. Shelving lined the walls, floor to ceiling, and the shelves were full of glass jars. Not a haphazard jumble. Rows of them, hundreds of them, each one labeled in a small, precise hand. And each jar held seeds, not just scooped at random, sorted by something. The labels had dates on them, years, codes she didn't understand, and words she understood all too well written over and over down the rows. Drought trial, blight resistance, crossbreed generation 3, crossbreed generation 7, survivor stock. Wren came down the rest of the ladder slowly, like a girl moving through a dream, and stepped out onto the concrete floor. There was a long metal table running down the center of the room. On it sat instruments she half recognized from a high school science class she'd barely paid attention to. Humidity meters, soil samples sealed in labeled plastic, a microscope under a fitted cloth cover, and binders. Stacks and stacks of binders, thick ones, their spines labeled by year going back, she saw, more than 20 years. This was not a hobby. This was not the puttering of a lonely old woman. This was research, decades of it. Careful, patient, relentless research, hidden in the dark beneath a dead orchard while the whole valley went brown above it. Wren stood in the middle of all of it, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. And she did not understand. The woman who'd lived up there in that dusty kitchen, the woman everyone in town thought had nothing, the woman Wren had spent 12 years believing was just a tired old failure who'd given up on everything, including her own granddaughter. That woman had built this, had filled it, had labored down here in the cool and the dark year after year after year alone. Why, for what? And then her flashlight beam reached the far end of the metal table, and she saw the box. It was small. Cedar wood, golden and smooth, the kind of box a person makes by hand. It sat by itself at the end of the table, set apart from everything else in a clear space someone had deliberately left for it. And carved into the lid in letters that someone had taken great care to make, even and deep, was a name. Her name. Wren Calloway. She didn't move for a long moment. The room was so quiet she could hear her own heart. Then she crossed to the box, and her hands, she noticed distantly, were shaking. She lifted the lid. Inside lay 2 things: a thick notebook worn soft at the edges, and a single folded letter. She took out the letter first. The paper was good heavy. She unfolded it carefully, and the moment she saw the handwriting, something in her chest dropped away. She knew that handwriting, strong but slanted slightly to the right. She had seen it before a long time ago on birthday cards that came for a few years and then stopped. She had thrown those cards away. She had told herself she didn't care. But she knew the hand the way you know a voice, the way you know a face somewhere deeper than memory. She held the letter close in the dim light and she read, "If you're reading this," the letter began, "then it means I never got the chance to explain it to your face. And for that, more than anything, I am sorry." Wren's jaw set hard. She almost stopped right there. She'd heard apologies before. The system was full of them. People who were so very sorry right up until the moment they handed you off to the next house. But she didn't stop. She read on. The letter told her things she had never known. It told her about the years after Wren's mother was gone. The years the old woman had tried to raise a small child alone on a failing farm in a drying valley. It told her about the medical bills, the surgery, the long recovery, the second mortgage, the bankruptcy that came after. It told her about a day in a courtroom when a judge had looked at an aging, broke, increasingly sick woman and a frightened 6-year-old and made a decision that the woman had fought and finally brokenly accepted. That the child would have a better chance, better schools, better care, a real future in the system. With anyone. With people who weren't poor and weren't dying and weren't already losing the roof over their own heads. I signed those papers, the letter said, with a pen that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I signed them in a room with no windows. And then I drove home alone and I stood on that porch and I watched the car take you down that road, and I did not chase it. Do you know how badly I wanted to chase it? Wren stopped reading. No, she said. The word came out hard and flat, bouncing off the concrete walls. No. If she loved me, she would have fought. You fight for the people you love. You don't sign them away and tell yourself it's for their own good. She tossed the letter onto the metal table. The anger was back hot and defensive, the old armor snapping back into place. It was too convenient, this letter. Too neat. Medical bills and judges and a heartbroken old woman who only ever wanted the best. Anyone could write that. Anyone could die and leave behind a beautiful story to make themselves the hero of an ending they'd actually run away from. She grabbed the notebook instead. If the letter was lies, maybe the notebook was the truth. She opened it and began to turn the pages fast at first, then slower. It was not a diary. Not at first. It was data. Records. Page after page after page, in that same precise hand, documenting the slow death of farming across the western valleys. Crop failures year by year. Wells running dry, mapped and dated. Aquifer levels. Rainfall dropping. And running all through it a single thread that Wren's eye kept snagging on, a single name that appeared again and again. Meridian. Meridian Agri-Science buying up failing farms across 3 counties. Meridian approaching the struggling and the desperate with offers that were just generous enough to feel like rescue. And Meridian, the notebook said in entry after entry, coming after one thing in particular. One thing they wanted more than dirt and water rights. One thing the old woman had spent 2 decades down in this cellar trying to perfect. A strain of apple, crossbred patiently over generations. A tree that could survive the drought that was killing everything else. A tree that needed almost no water, that shrugged off the blight that could grow and bear fruit in soil and conditions where every other variety simply gave up and died. Wren's breath had gone slow and shallow now. She turned more pages, and somewhere near the back the entries changed. The tone shifted. Less data. More voice. The careful scientist falling away, and the woman underneath coming through. They came again today. One entry read, "The same young man with the easy smile. Reese. He thinks I don't understand what they're really after. He thinks I'm just a stubborn old woman sitting on a piece of dirt. Let him think it." And below that, in a different ink on a different day, "I won't let them have it. Not until it's ready. Not until she's ready." Wren stared at that line. She. She turned the page and the data was gone entirely now. The last pages were not science. They were memory. The old woman had written down the time Wren had broken her arm, falling off the porch rail age 4, and how she'd carried her 20 miles to the nearest doctor in a truck that kept stalling. She had written down the stuffed coyote, the ragged gray one that the child had refused to sleep without, and how she'd had to wash it in the dark and dry it by the stove so it would be back in the crib by morning. She had written down the way the little girl used to insist with absolute 6-year-old certainty that apples tasted better eaten straight off the tree, still warm from the sun. Wren had forgotten the coyote. She had forgotten the broken arm. She had not forgotten the apples. The words swam suddenly, and she realized her eyes had filled. And she blinked hard, and the tears fell onto the page, and the ink bloomed and spread, and she made a sound she didn't recognize as her own. She picked the letter back up off the table. Her hands were shaking now for a different reason. She found where she'd stopped, and she made herself read the rest. I stayed away. The letter said, so that you could have a future I couldn't give you, with my own 2 hands. A future where you weren't watching me get sick. A future where you weren't going hungry so I could buy a seed. That was the only gift I had left to give you. And so I gave it. I let you go. But I never stopped working. Every day you were gone, I worked. Because I knew that one day this land would come to you. And I swore that when it did, it would not be worthless. It would not be a burden. It would be a choice. The choice I never had. Everything down here is yours. The trees that still stand out there are not dead wren. They are sleeping. They are the strongest things I ever made, and they are waiting the same as I was waiting for you. I built this so that you could choose your own future. I'm only sorry I won't be here to watch you choose it. Love is not always the thing that stays. Sometimes love is the thing that lets go, so that someone else can live. Wren sat down hard on the metal stool by the table. She didn't cry exactly. It was bigger than crying. It was the slow, grinding collapse of something she had built and lived inside for 12 years. The story of herself. The story where she was the girl nobody wanted, the girl who'd been thrown away, the girl who knew better than to expect anyone to come back for her. She had carried that story like armor. It had protected her. It had let her stop hoping, and not hoping had kept her safe. And now, down in the cool dark under a dead orchard with her grandmother's handwriting blurring in front of her and the smell of seed and earth all around her, the armor was coming apart at the seams. She had been wrong. For 12 years about the single most important thing in her life. She had been wrong. Upstairs, the house was silent. Outside, the orchard still looked dead, every gnarled black branch of it. But down here, beneath the rot and the dust and the years of careful, lonely labor, something had been alive the whole time. Something had been waiting. Something her grandmother had built with her own rough, weathered hands. The same hands that had once lifted a little girl up onto a hip and held her there and told her she was safe. Wren did not call Dalton Reese that morning. She stayed down in the cellar until her phone went dark, reading every binder, every label, every page, learning the shape of the thing her grandmother had spent her life on. And the more she read, the more one thing became clear. A thing that turned the cold air colder. Meridian wanted this, not the dead orchard, not the dry well. They wanted what was down here, what her grandmother had refused to sell, what they had been circling for years. And now the only thing standing between a billion-dollar company and the thing they wanted was an 18-year-old girl with a prepaid debit card and nowhere else in the world to go. She climbed up out of the cellar in the late afternoon, blinking in the light. The cedar box held tight against her chest. She walked out onto the sagging porch and stood looking at the orchard. And she saw it differently now. Not as a graveyard, as a field of sleepers. As trial plots mapped in a notebook in a precise and stubborn hand. as the longest, most patient act of love she had ever heard of, carried out in secret by a woman the world had written off for a child who had spent her whole life believing she'd been left behind. She would not sell. She knew that now the way she'd known to refuse Dalton Reese on a bench in a bus station 1,000 years ago. She didn't know how she'd fight, or what fighting would even look like, or how a girl with nothing could stand against a company with everything. But she knew she would not sell. She was still standing there working it through when she heard the car. It came up the long dirt drive, slow tires crunching over gravel, raising a thin banner of dust against the lowering sun. Not the black SUV she'd half expected. A dusty sedan, older, the kind a person drives a lot of hard miles in. It rolled to a stop at the edge of the dead orchard, and the engine cut off, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the door opened and a woman got out. She was tall, middle-aged, maybe a little past it, with iron-gray hair pulled back severe from a sharp, intelligent face. She wore practical clothes, boots that had seen real dirt, and she stood there at the edge of the property with one hand resting on the open car door, looking up at the orchard, at the house, at the girl on the porch, with an expression Wren couldn't begin to read. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't unfriendly. It was the careful, measuring look of someone who has been waiting a very long time for this exact moment and isn't yet sure how it's gonna go. Wren came down off the porch one slow step at a time, the cedar box still held against her chest like a shield. "This is private property," she said. Her voice didn't shake, and she was proud of that. "You're going to want to tell me who you are." The woman didn't answer right away. Her eyes went from Wren's face down to the box in her arms, and Wren saw the woman recognize it. The cedar, the carving, and something flickered across that sharp face, something that might have been grief or relief or both. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and even and absolutely certain. "My name is Cordelia Frost," she said. "And before you decide anything, before you sign anything, before you trust anyone in this valley, including me, you need to understand something." She looked up at the orchard, at all those dead and sleeping trees, standing black against the gold of the dying light. And then she looked back at Wren. "I have a claim to what's in that cellar," Cordelia Frost said quietly, "and I'm not the only one who knows it's down there." For a long moment, the two of them just stood there in the failing light. The girl and the stranger, with 12 dead miles of orchard between them, and the dust still settling around the older woman's car. "A claim," Wren said finally. The word came out flat. "Lady, I don't even know you. You drive up my road onto my land, and the first thing out of your mouth is that you've got a claim to my grandmother's things." She took a step back toward the porch, the cedar box hard against her chest. "I think you should go." Cordelia Frost didn't move. She had the stillness of someone who had learned somewhere that you don't win an argument by raising your voice. You win it by not flinching. "I knew Marlene," she said. "Better than anyone in that town ever did. Better, I'd guess, than you got the chance to." Her eyes flicked to the box again. She made that box herself. Cedar because it keeps the moths out of the seed. She carved your name into it 3 winters ago. I watched her do it at that kitchen table with a pocket knife and a pair of reading glasses held together with tape. A pause. "She talked about you every single day I knew her." Wren's throat tightened. She hated that it did. "Then why," she said, "if you knew her so well, did I never hear your name, not once, not in any of it?" She gestured back at the house, at the cellar beneath it. "She wrote everything down. Everything. And you're not in it." For the first time, something cracked in the older woman's composure. A small thing. A tightening at the corners of the eyes. "No," Cordelia said. "I wouldn't be. That was the point of me." She looked away out at the dead rose. Marlene was smarter than all of them. She knew that if Meridian ever found out she wasn't working alone, the danger doubled. So she kept me off the page. No letters with my name, no entries. Nothing they could find if they ever got into that cellar. She turned back. I'm the part of the plan she couldn't afford to write down. It was a good answer. That was the trouble with it. Wren had spent her whole life around people who gave good answers. Smooth answers, answers that fit a little too well. She had learned not to trust the ones that fit. I'm tired, she said. And I'm not signing anything and I'm not trusting anyone, and that includes you. You said it yourself. She climbed the porch steps. Come back in daylight if you've got something real to say. Right now, you're just a stranger on my road. She expected the woman to argue, to push, to do the thing they always did, find the angle, work the crack. Instead, Cordelia Frost nodded slowly, as if Wren had passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. Good, she said. Don't trust me. Don't trust the lawyer in town either. Not all the way, not yet. And whatever you do, she opened her car door. Don't be alone out here at night with that hatch unlocked. They've been waiting on this land a long time, girl. They've just been waiting for someone easier to deal with than your grandmother. She got in, started the engine. I'll come back in the daylight. You'll have questions by then. You'll want to hear the answers. And then she was gone. Taillights bouncing down the dark drive, and Wren stood alone on the porch, with the box in her arms and a cold knot in her stomach that had nothing to do with the desert night coming on. She did not sleep much. She lay on the lumpy couch with the lantern burning and the loaded silence of the orchard outside, and somewhere past midnight, she got up, found a length of chain and an old padlock in the barn, and chained the cellar hatch shut. It probably wouldn't stop anyone who really wanted in, but it made her feel less like a thing waiting to be taken. In the morning, she walked the 12 miles back toward town. Halfway there, a county truck slowed and gave her a ride the rest of the way, and the driver, a heavy-set man with a county logo on his shirt, made small talk. That wasn't really small talk. You're the Calloway girl, he said. Folks are talking. Heard Meridian made you a real fair offer. He glanced sideways. Be a smart thing taking it. Hard country out there for a young person alone. Real hard. Wren said nothing, but she filed it away. A man she'd never met who somehow knew about an offer made in a private phone call. Word didn't travel that fast in a town this size. Word like that was carried. There was one law office in Cedar Bluff, a small brick storefront on the main street, with gold letters flaking off the window. Briggs Law. She pushed open the door and a bell jangled and a man looked up from behind a desk buried in paper. He was old, past 60, well past it, with silver hair combed back neat, and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses perched low on a long, careful face. He had the look of a man who had once been sharp and important somewhere bigger than this, and had come down in the world, and had made a kind of peace with it that wasn't entirely peace. His handshake when he rose to take her hand was firm, but cautious, like a man who had learned the hard way what it cost to misjudge things. Halford Briggs, he said. What can I do for you, young lady? She told him who she was. She watched it land, watched the careful face go very still. Marlene Calloway's granddaughter, he said slowly. He sat back down. He took the glasses off, polished them on his shirt. A man buying himself a moment. I see. You knew her. I did some legal work for her, years back. He put the glasses back on. Property matters. Some filings. He folded his hands on the desk. She was a determined woman. That word again. Everyone in this town reached for the same word when they talked about Marlene Calloway, and Wren was beginning to understand that it wasn't quite a compliment. It was something they said, instead of the things they wouldn't say. She put the notebook on his desk, then the letter unfolded, and she watched him read. He read for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked into the silence between them. And as he read, the lawyer changed. The careful, settled, slightly defeated old man straightened in his chair. His eyes sharpened behind the wire rims. By the time he turned the last page, he was a different man than the one who'd shaken her hand. And when he looked up at her, his voice had dropped into something low and intent. "Do you understand what this is?" he said. "My grandmother's research. It's more than that." He tapped the notebook with one finger. "If this data holds up, if these trees are what she says they are, and if the records are dated the way they appear to be dated." He stopped, made himself slow down. "Miss Calloway, a company like Meridian does not chase a worthless piece of dirt across 3 counties for years. They do not offer $15,000 for land they themselves are calling dead. They want something." He laid his hand flat on the pages. "They want this. And I'd stake my license that they don't just want to buy it. They want it gone." Wren left that office with the first thing she'd had in 12 years that felt like a plan. Briggs would file what he called preliminary protections paperwork to establish that the research existed, that it belonged to her, that it was hers to control. It would take a few days. In the meantime, he told her document everything. Photograph the cellar. Photograph the trees. Make copies. Above all, he said, his voice dropping again, tell no one what you have, and trust no one who tells you. They already know. She thought about Cordelia Frost when he said that. She didn't mention her. She didn't know why. She walked back out into the heat, and she felt for the first time something like hope. It lasted exactly 2 days. On the 3rd morning, she walked out to check the irrigation lines, the ones her grandmother's notebook said fed the southern rows the strongest of the sleeping trees. She'd spent the prior afternoon clearing them, getting the old pump primed, coaxing the first thin trickle of water down the cracked channels in 12 years. The lines were cut, not worn through, not failed. Cut. 3 separate places, clean straight slices through the heavy black pipe. The kind a sharp blade makes in a single confident stroke. The water she'd worked so hard to get flowing had drained out into the hardpack and vanished, leaving dark stains in the dust that were already going pale. She knelt in the dirt and stared at the severed pipe and felt the cold come back into her stomach. There were no footprints, no tire tracks. Whoever had done it had been careful, had come and gone like smoke. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't meant to look like one. It was a message. We can reach you. We can touch your land in the night and leave nothing behind. Stop. She drove the old farm truck she'd gotten running into town to tell Briggs. And that was when the second blow landed. Your filing's been kicked back, he said. He had a county form in his hand, his jaw tight. Clerk's office says it was, and I'm quoting, misrouted, lost in transit between offices. They're asking me to refile from the beginning. He set the paper down very carefully, the way you set down something you'd like to throw. Miss Calloway, I have been practicing law in this county for 30 years. I have filed 10,000 documents at that window. Nothing of mine has ever once been misrouted. He looked at her over the wire rims. Until now. That afternoon, a story appeared on a regional agriculture blog. The kind that ranchers and farmers across the western slope actually read. It didn't name her outright. It didn't have to. A teenage heir, it said, fresh out of the foster system, with no education and no resources, was attempting to lay claim to proprietary agricultural research she could not possibly have produced or understood. It raised questions in a reasonable, concerned, civic-minded tone about whether such a claim could possibly be legitimate. about whether someone was perhaps taking advantage of a vulnerable young person, putting words and ownership in her mouth, using her as a front. It was poison, and it was clever because it dressed itself up as worry. By evening, when Wren stopped at the feed store for fence wire, the conversation by the register died the moment she walked in. Two men she didn't know looked at her, then looked away. The old man behind the counter, the same one who'd told her she was Marlene's girl, rang her up without quite meeting her eyes. This was how it worked, she was beginning to understand. Not with threats, not with thugs in the night, not really. With friction. With 1,000 small frictions. A cut line here, a lost form, there a quiet word in the right ear, a tone of reasonable concern, all of it designed not to break her in one blow, but to wear her down, grind her flat, exhaust her into doing the smart, easy, sensible thing and signing the papers and going away. The black SUV finally came on a Friday. She heard it before she saw it. The heavy, smooth engine, and she was out at the southern rows with a shovel when it rolled up the drive and stopped. A man got out. She knew somehow before he opened his mouth that this was the voice from the phone. Dalton Reese was younger than she'd pictured, and better dressed in clothes that were trying hard to look like a working man's and failing. He took off his sunglasses and folded them into his shirt pocket and gave her a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and the brittle, dead branches of the orchard were reflected in the SUV's black paint behind him. "Wren," he said warmly, as if they were old friends. "I was in the area. Thought I'd come introduce myself properly." She didn't put down the shovel. "You're in over your head," he said gently after the pleasantries he tried and she didn't return. "I mean that kindly. You're a smart girl, anybody can see that. But litigation is expensive. Validating research is expensive. You're talking about going up against a company with a legal department bigger than this whole town. And you're doing it on what?" He glanced at the truck, the house, the patched lines. "We're offering you stability, Wren. A clean start. No fighting, no lawyers, no lying awake at night. Just take the money and let all of this be somebody else's problem." Wren looked at him for a long moment. "Stability," she said. "For who?" The smile flickered. "Because I've been thinking about it," she went on, and her voice was steady, and that steadiness surprised them both. "If this land is dead like you keep saying, then it's worthless. And Meridian doesn't waste a Friday afternoon driving a man out here to lean on an 18-year-old over something worthless. So either you're lying about the land or you're lying about why you want it. And either way, Mr. Reese, you just told me everything I needed to know." The warmth went out of his face all at once. For just a second before he caught it, she saw what was underneath. Not anger. Calculation. The flat, cold, recalibrating look of a man who has just realized the easy job is going to be a hard one. "The offer won't stand forever," he said. And the kindness was gone from it now. It was just a fact laid down flat. He put his sunglasses back on, got in the SUV and drove away, and Wren stood there with her shovel and watched the dust of him fade down the road, and knew that she had just made an enemy who would not forgive her for it. That evening, Briggs called and asked her to come into town. She found him in his office with the blinds drawn and the door shut, which she would later learn was not how Halford Briggs ordinarily kept his office. He looked older than he had 3 days before. He waved her to a chair and sat heavily in his own, and for a while he didn't say anything at all. "They came to see me," he said at last. "Not Reese. Higher than Reese. A man in a suit that cost more than my car, with a briefcase he never opened, who suggested very politely, you understand very reasonably, that I reconsider my involvement in this matter." He took off his glasses. He did not polish them this time. He just held them, turning them in his hands. And then he mentioned just in passing, just conversationally, certain matters from my past. Professional matters. Old matters that I had thought were behind me. He laughed, a short, dry sound with no humor in it. He let me know that those matters could become current again if I weren't careful about where I put my time. Wren's stomach dropped. "Then you should stop," she said. The words came out before she'd decided to say them. "I mean it. You don't owe me this. You don't even really know me. I'm not gonna let them ruin you over a fight that's mine." The old lawyer was quiet for a long moment. Then he set his glasses down on the desk and he looked at her, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Something raw and old and long buried. "There's a thing I need to tell you," he said, "and I'd ask you to hear all of it before you decide what to do with it." She waited. "Years ago, Briggs said your grandmother came to see me, not unlike how you walked in the other day. She had a problem with Meridian even back then. They were circling, making offers, applying that same quiet pressure they're applying to you now. And she was frightened, and she was alone, and she came to me because I was the only lawyer in this county, and she asked me to help her fight them." He stopped. The clock ticked. "I told her to sell," he said. "I told her the fight wasn't worth it. I told her she was an old woman with no money going up against a company that could bury her in paper until she died of old age. And that the smart thing, the sensible thing, the only thing was to take their offer and walk away while she still could." His voice had gone rough. "I want you to understand that I believed I was helping her. I believed I was protecting her from a fight that would destroy her. That's what I told myself." "And she didn't sell," Wren said quietly. "No." Briggs almost smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. "She did not. She looked at me, this little old woman in a coat too thin for the weather, and she said, 'Mr. Briggs, you are telling me to give up the only thing I have left to leave her.' And she walked out of this office, and she never came back. And she fought them alone in the dark in that cellar for the rest of her life, because the one man in this town she came to for help told her to lie down." The office was very quiet now. Wren found she couldn't speak. "They squeezed her after that," Briggs went on lower. "I heard about it the way you hear about things in a small town. The lost loan she should have gotten. The water rights that got tangled up in red tape for years. The vendors who suddenly wouldn't sell to her. I knew it was them, and I knew why, and I told myself it wasn't my business because she'd walked out of my office, and that made it not my business." He looked down at his own hands. "I let them isolate a frightened old woman until she died alone at the end of a dirt road. And I told myself the whole time that I was a reasonable man making reasonable choices." He looked up. "So when that man in the expensive suit sat in that chair you're sitting in and told me to walk away from her granddaughter," Halford Briggs said, "and reminded me of all the reasons a sensible man would do exactly that, I'll tell you what I felt. I felt like I was being given something almost no one ever gets in this life." His jaw tightened. A second chance to make the right call. The same call. The exact same call twice in one lifetime. He stood slowly, an old man with bad knees, and he came around the desk, and he held out his hand to her the way he had the first day, except that everything about it was different now. "I told her to sell all those years ago," he said. "I was wrong then. I have known I was wrong every single day since." His grip was firm. "I will not be wrong again. Not this time. Whatever it costs me. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Wren took his hand, and she found she couldn't answer because her throat had closed. And so she just held on, and the old man held on. And outside the drawn blinds, The little town went about its evening as if nothing at all had changed, when in fact something had changed enormously in a small brick office between an orphan and the man who had failed her grandmother, and meant this time to make it right. She drove back out to the orchard that night with the windows down and the cold desert air pouring in, and she felt the fear sitting heavy in her chest, and underneath it something harder and steadier than fear. She walked the rows with a flashlight before she slept. She did it every night now, a habit she'd fallen into without deciding to, checking the lines, checking the soil, checking the trees. The orchard still looked dead in the dark, all those black skeletal branches clawing at the stars. But she saw it differently now. She saw the trial plots mapped in the notebook overlaid on the land like a ghost. She saw the labels on the jars, the years and years of patient labor. She saw an old woman down in that cellar in the lamplight alone, abandoned by the one man who could have stood beside her working and working and working because she had one thing left, to leave the granddaughter she'd let go, and she would not let them take it. Wren was scared. Honestly, soberly scared. Meridian had lawyers and money and patience and reach. She had a notebook, a leaky truck, a lawyer with a guilty conscience, and a dead orchard full of sleeping trees. If she'd been a betting woman, she would not have bet on herself. But the fear didn't push her toward the road this time. It pushed her the other way. It pushed her down into her own heels. If they wanted the orchard, she thought, looking out at all those waiting trees under all those cold stars, they would have to come and take it from her in the daylight where everyone could see. She slept a little, finally near dawn, and it was the next morning, going through the binders one more time in the gray early light, looking for anything Briggs could use, that she found the thing that changed everything. She'd read these binders a dozen times, but she'd been reading them as a granddaughter, looking for the woman, not as a soldier, looking for a weapon. This time she read differently. This time she read the way Briggs had taught her to read, asking of every page, what does this prove and to whom does it matter? And she found it on a page near the back of the oldest binder. A binder so old the plastic had gone yellow and brittle. A page she had skimmed past every time because it was just numbers, just a dense block of technical notation she didn't understand. Except this time she noticed the date at the top, and next to the date in her grandmother's hand, underlined twice 3 words: original parent stock. Wren went very still. She knew from the binders that Meridian's whole empire, the thing that had made them a billion-dollar company, was built on a patented strain of drought-resistant crop. It was in the notebook in her grandmother's furious, cramped marginal notes. Meridian's miracle seed. Meridian's protected, proprietary, jealously guarded golden goose, licensed to farms across the whole dry West. The foundation of everything they were. And here in her grandmother's hand, dated more than 20 years ago, were the parent crosses, the originals, the early generations of the exact trait Meridian had built their fortune on, dated years before Meridian had ever filed a single patent. She didn't understand all the science, but she understood the dates. And she understood suddenly and completely the thing that turned the whole world over. Meridian didn't want the orchard because it was valuable. Meridian wanted the orchard because it was evidence. Her grandmother hadn't just been hiding research that Meridian wanted to own. She'd been holding the proof that Meridian's entire fortune was built on a lie. That the trait they'd patented, the thing they sold and licensed and sued people over, the foundation of their whole empire, had existed before their patent. Right here, in this dirt, grown by her hands. It was called prior art. Briggs would teach her the term later, but she understood the thing itself the moment she saw those dates. If you could prove an invention existed before someone patented it, the patent was worthless. Worse than worthless. The patent was theft. And if the world ever saw these dates, these crosses, these living trees standing in the dirt. Older than Meridian's patent then, Meridian's billion-dollar monopoly didn't just take a hit. It collapsed. The whole thing. The licenses, the lawsuits, the empire. All of it built on a patent that had never been legitimate in the first place, all of it. Sitting on top of a buried truth in a cellar, under a dead orchard at the end of a 12-mile dirt road, guarded for 20 years by a stubborn old woman. Everyone in town had written off as just determined. Wren sat back on her heels in the gray light, with the brittle yellow binder open in her lap, and her hands were shaking, and for a moment she could barely breathe. That was why they'd never just bulldozed the place, why the offers the patience, the careful pressure instead of brute force. They couldn't simply take it, because if anyone ever asked the right questions, the answers were buried right here, and a violent seizure would only draw the eyes they most needed to keep away. They needed her to sell, to sign it over willingly, quietly, legally, so they could destroy every trace of it, with no one ever knowing what had been destroyed. That was why $15,000 a sum, that meant nothing to a company that size a sum, calculated to be just enough to tempt a desperate orphan, and not 1 cent more. They weren't buying land, they were buying silence. And she had almost given it to them for the price of a used car and a fresh start. She heard the car coming up the drive, then the now familiar crunch of tires on gravel. The dusty sedan, and she looked out the window and saw Cordelia Frost getting out in the daylight just as she'd promised that sharp, gray-haired woman standing at the edge of the orchard looking up at the house. Wren clutched the binder to her chest and stood up. She didn't know yet who Cordelia Frost really was, ally or enemy, friend her grandmother had trusted, or one more hand reaching for the buried thing. But she knew now what was at stake. She knew now that this was no longer a fight about a piece of dead land. This was a fight about the truth. And somewhere out there behind Dalton Reese, behind the man in the expensive suit, behind the cut lines and the lost filings and the poisoned blog, there was a person at the top of Meridian who had built an entire empire on a stolen patent, and who had spent 20 years making sure the one woman who could prove it died alone and silent in the dark. Wren walked out onto the porch to meet Cordelia Frost in the morning light. And the question that had haunted her for 12 years had finally completely changed. It was no longer, why didn't she fight for me? It was, who exactly am I really fighting? Cordelia Frost came up the porch steps slow, the way you approach something that might still bolt. She looked at the binder Wren held against her chest, and she looked at Wren's face, and whatever she saw there made her stop 2 steps down and stay there. "You found it," Cordelia said. It wasn't a question. The parents stuck. The dates. Wren's grip tightened on the binder. "How do you know what I found?" "Because it's the only thing in that cellar worth a woman's whole life," Cordelia said. "And because I helped her record some of it." She held up both hands, slow, empty. "I told you I had a claim. I think you've earned the truth of what that means. May I sit?" Wren looked at her a long moment. Then she nodded at the steps, and the older woman sat, and Wren sat too, a careful distance away, the binder still in her lap, like a thing she might have to run with. "I'm a plant geneticist," Cordelia said. "Or I was. I taught at the State Agricultural College for 20 years. She looked out at the dead rows. "Your grandmother and I corresponded for the last 6 of them. She found me, actually. Sent me a packet of data in the mail, no return address. Just a request that I verify whether what she was seeing in her trees was real." A faint, sad smile. It was real. It was more than real. In 30 years of this work, I never saw anything like what that woman grew with a pocket knife and a prayer in the dirt out here. "Then why hide you?" Wren said. "Why keep you off every page?" Because Marlene understood something I didn't at first. Cordelia's voice dropped. She understood that her research was only safe as long as Meridian believed it would die with her. One stubborn old woman, no money, no allies, no way to get the data validated by anyone the courts would believe. They could afford to wait her out. They could afford to be patient and gentle and let nature take its course. She turned to look at Wren. But the moment Meridian learned there was a second person, a credentialed scientist, with the standing to authenticate her work and carry it forward after she was gone, then waiting wasn't safe anymore. Then they'd have had to act against both of us, so she kept me invisible. She protected me by erasing me. And she made me promise that I would stay erased and stay away until the land passed to you. To me, Wren said. To you. Cordelia held her eyes. She gave me a sealed copy of everything. Every binder, every cross, every date duplicated and notarized and locked in a safe deposit box 300 miles from here. And she gave me one instruction. When the girl inherits, she said, and not one day before you go to her, you tell her what she's holding, and you help her finish it. The older woman's voice caught just slightly. She made me swear I wouldn't come a single day early. Not to the funeral. Not to settle her affairs. Nothing that would put my name anywhere near hers, while there was still breath in her to protect. She looked down at her own hands. So I waited. I waited and I watched the obituary. And I waited some more until the county recorder showed the deed in your name. And then I drove out here, which is why I came up that road like a stranger girl. Because to keep you safe, that's exactly what I had to be. Wren sat very still. Everything in her wanted still to find the lie in it, the angle to crack. That was 12 years of training, and it didn't switch off because a sad-eyed woman told a good story on a porch. But there was the box. Cordelia had known about the cedar box before she'd seen it. Had known about the carving. Had known about the dates in a binder Wren had only found that morning. And there was the simple structural sense of it, the way it fit the cold cleverness of everything else her grandmother had done. Of course she'd kept a second copy. Of course she'd kept a witness, a woman who built a hidden laboratory under a dead orchard and disguised the most valuable evidence in the West as a worthless piece of dirt, would not have left her life's work to die on a single set of pages, in a single cellar, that a billion-dollar company was actively trying to get its hands on. Prove it, Wren said. The safe deposit box, the notarized copies. Prove it's real and then maybe I'll believe the rest. Cordelia smiled, and this time there was something fierce in it. I was hoping you'd say that, she said, because that, Wren, is exactly what's going to save you. Those copies notarized and dated, held by a credentialed witness with no financial stake in your land, that's what turns a teenage girl's wild story into evidence a court can't ignore. She stood. Your grandmother didn't just leave you proof. She left you a way to use it. She left you me. She looked down at the girl on the steps. Now, where's your lawyer? Because the three of us have a great deal of work to do and not much time to do it in. The work took weeks. It was nothing like the way these things look in stories. There were no dramatic confrontations, not at first. There were long days in Briggs's office with the blinds drawn, the three of them around his paper-buried desk, building the thing piece by careful piece. Briggs filed again, and this time he hand-carried every document to the county seat himself, and got date-stamped receipts for all of it, and stood at the window until he watched it logged into the system with his own eyes. Cordelia retrieved the sealed copies from the bank 300 miles away and brought them back in a locked case. She didn't let out of her sight. She drew in 2 colleagues from out-of-state scientists with no connection to the valley and no reason to lie to independently examine the trees and the records, and Meridian fought back exactly the way Briggs had said they would. With paper. With money. With time. They challenged the legitimacy of Marlene's research. They challenged the chain of custody on the data, suggesting it could have been fabricated after the fact. They challenged the dates themselves, hiring their own experts to swear the notebooks could have been written any time. They questioned Wren directly in filings that painted her exactly as the blog had an uneducated girl from the system being used as a front by an opportunistic scientist and a washed-up rural lawyer with a grudge. They questioned everything because that was the strategy, to make everything a question, to drown a single fragile truth in a flood of expensive doubt, to make it all so slow and so costly and so exhausting that a poor girl with no resources would simply break and walk away. It nearly worked. There were nights Wren lay awake doing arithmetic that had no good answer. The dwindling balance on the prepaid card against the bottomless balance of a company that could spend her into the ground without noticing. There were mornings she walked the rows and the trees still looked dead, and the whole thing felt like a fever she talked herself into. There were moments she thought about Dalton Reese's flat, cold voice saying the offer won't stand forever, and wondered if the smartest thing, the sensible thing, the only thing was to take whatever they'd still give her and go. But every time she got close to that edge, she'd go down into the cellar. She'd sit in the cool dark among the labeled jars and the binders in the cedar box with her name carved in it. And she'd think about an old woman working down here alone, abandoned, frightened year after year, refusing to lie down. And she'd climb back up out of the dark, and she would not lie down either. Then came the depositions. This was where Briggs had been steering them the whole time. Wren understood now. Not toward a quiet settlement, which was what Meridian wanted, what Meridian always wanted, things done quietly in the dark off the page. Toward the opposite. Toward testimony sworn and recorded, where a man had to sit in a chair and answer questions under oath, where the careful machinery of money and silence had to operate in the daylight, with a stenographer writing down every word. And the breakthrough, when it came, did not come from a document. It came from a name. Cordelia found it. She had been going back through the oldest binder, the brittle yellow one, cross-referencing Marlene's early crosses against the public record of Meridian's original patent filing, building the prior art timeline tree by tree, date by date. And late one night in Briggs's office, under the buzz of the fluorescent lights, she went very still over a page, and then she slid the binder across the desk to Wren without a word and pointed. It was a margin note, old, faded, from the very earliest years of the research, decades back, before the orchard had been hidden before any of it. Just a few words in her grandmother's hand. A working note about a cross she'd made with a research partner back when the work was young and shared and full of hope. A name. The partner's name. Royce Vance. Wren didn't recognize it, but Cordelia did. And Briggs, when she said it aloud, set down his pen very slowly and looked up with the expression of a man watching the last piece of something terrible slide into place. Royce Vance, Briggs said quietly, is the founder and chief executive of Meridian Agriscience. The room was silent. He's on their public materials, Briggs went on. The visionary founder. Built the company from nothing 30 years ago on his breakthrough discovery of the trait. He looked at the binder, at the margin note, at the date beside it. His breakthrough. And there it was, the whole shape of it finally visible. It hadn't been a faceless company circling a worthless piece of dirt. It had never been that. Decades ago, two researchers had worked together on a drought-resistant strain out here, when the science was young, and the work was a partnership. And one of them, Royce Vance, had taken that shared work, taken the trait that wasn't his alone to take, and walked away with it. He'd patented it under his own name. He'd built an empire on it. He'd become rich and powerful and celebrated as a visionary, and the foundation of all of it was a thing he'd stolen from a partner he'd left behind in the dirt. And the partner he'd left behind was Marlene Calloway. Suddenly, all of it made a terrible human sense. The patience, the persistence, the way Meridian had circled this one small orchard for 20 years with a focus that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with fear. It wasn't a company protecting an asset. It was a man protecting a lie. A man who knew better than anyone alive that out here at the end of a dirt road in the dirt, and in a stubborn old woman's careful hand, sat the living proof that everything he was had been stolen. The trees themselves growing dated witnessed. The crosses in her own handwriting from years before his patent. The truth of who had really made the thing that made him rich. That was why he'd never let her be. Why the loans had dried up and the water rights had tangled and the vendors had turned her away. Why he'd made sure the one lawyer in the county told her to give up. It had never been business. It had been a man systematically isolating and silencing the one person on earth who could expose him, grinding her down across a lifetime, waiting for her to die alone so the secret would die with her. He had nearly won. She had died alone exactly as he'd arranged. He just hadn't counted on the orchard passing to a granddaughter too stubborn to take the money. And he hadn't counted on the second copy, the hidden witness, the part of the plan Marlene had been too smart to write down. "This changes the deposition," Briggs said. His voice had gone hard and clear. "We don't ask him about a patent. We ask him about a partnership. We put that name in front of him under oath." He looked at Wren, and we see what a man who's spent 30 years burying the truth does when it's finally sitting on the table in front of him in the daylight. The deposition was held in a glass-walled conference room in a regional office 2 hours away. The kind of room where the powerful are used to being comfortable. Royce Vance came with 3 lawyers and the easy confidence of a man who had never lost anything in his life. He was older now, silver-haired, expensively dressed with a politician's warmth and a hunter's eyes. He shook hands all around. He called Wren young lady in a tone of gentle public sympathy, as if he were the wrong party generously enduring a misunderstanding. He had clearly been told he would face a frightened orphan, a guilty old lawyer, and a thin file of unprovable claims, and he had clearly decided this would be an easy morning. Briggs let him think it. For an hour, Briggs asked dull procedural questions, patent dates, filing histories, corporate structures, the kind of thing that makes a powerful man's eyes glaze, that makes him relax, that makes him stop watching the man asking. Vance answered smoothly, even indulgently. The visionary founder reciting the founding myth he'd told 1,000 times. And then, Briggs, in exactly the same dull procedural tone, slid a photocopy across the polished table. The brittle yellow page, the margin note the date. "Mr. Vance," he said, "can you identify the handwriting on this document?" A pause. The first pause of the morning. Vance glanced at the page. "I couldn't say. It's old. I don't recognize it." "It's the research notebook of Marlene Calloway," Briggs said. "Dated some years before your patent filing. I'd direct your attention to the margin note." He let it sit. "It records a crossbreeding trial, and it names 2 people who conducted it together." He looked up. "You're named Mr. Vance, by name, in her hand, as her research partner, years before you filed a patent claiming the trait as your sole invention." The room went very quiet. One of Vance's lawyers leaned in to murmur something, and Vance waved him off. A small, irritated gesture, the gesture of a man who is used to handling things himself and has just discovered that this thing is not being handled. "I never," he began, and stopped. Started again. "I worked with a great many people in those years. I don't recall every... You don't recall Marlene Calloway. I don't..." And there it was. The crack. So small. A flicker of the eyes toward the page, a tightening at the jaw, a half-second of pure animal fear, in a man who had not felt fear in 30 years. And then it was gone, smoothed over. But the stenographer had it, and Cordelia had seen it, and Wren had seen it. And most of all, Vance knew they had seen it. "I worked with a number of people," he said again, more carefully now. "If this person claims some involvement, that's a matter for this person," Wren said. She hadn't planned to speak. Briggs had told her to stay quiet to let him work. But it came out of her steady and clear across that polished table, and every head in the room turned. "You said this person," Wren said. "She was my grandmother. She raised me out there for 6 years, and then she gave me up because she was sick and broke, and she thought I'd have a better life than the one she could give me. And the whole time you were the reason she was sick and broke. You took her work. You took the thing she made. You got rich and famous off it, and then you spent the rest of her life making sure she stayed poor and alone so nobody would ever find out." Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that later. "She died at the end of a dirt road all by herself because of you. And she still beat you, because she left it all to me. And here I am." The room was silent. Royce Vance looked at her, and for one long moment the public warmth was completely gone from his face. And what was underneath was not a visionary and not a wronged party. It was just an old man who had built his whole life on a single theft, looking at the one thing he'd spent 30 years trying to make sure never happened. He didn't deny it. That was the thing Wren would remember. In that moment, with the truth on the table and the girl looking him in the eye, Royce Vance did not deny it. He just looked for one naked second, like a man who had finally been found. Then his lawyers were standing calling a recess gathering papers, and the moment closed. But it had happened. And it was on the record. It didn't end in that room. These things don't. It ended over the following months in the slow, grinding way that real things end. But the deposition had broken something open. And once it was open, it could not be closed again. The independent scientists confirmed the dates. The trees themselves, examined by experts who had never set foot in Cedar Bluff and had no reason to lie, were established beyond dispute to predate Meridian's patent. Cordelia's notarized copies, held by a credentialed witness with no stake in the land, turned a teenage girl's impossible story into a documented, defensible, terrifying case. Prior art. The patent was invalid, had been invalid from the day it was filed, which meant 30 years of licenses and lawsuits and fortune rested on nothing. Briggs took it where Vance had spent a lifetime making sure it could never go, into the daylight. He filed to invalidate the patent in open court where the record would be public. And a story very different from the poisoned little blog post of months before began to move through the agricultural press, and then beyond it, the story of a stolen partnership, a buried truth, a stubborn old woman and an orphaned girl who would not take the money. Meridian did the arithmetic. A trial meant the theft in full on the public record with Vance's deposition, and that half-second flicker of fear entered into evidence for the world to read. It meant the founding myth detonating in front of everyone. It meant the patent gone and the empire built on it gone with it. They settled. Of course they settled. Men like Royce Vance always reach at the very end for the quiet exit. But this time it was Wren's terms, not theirs. The patent was surrendered and the trait released into the public domain so that no one could ever again own or hoard or steal the thing Marlene Calloway had made, so that any farmer in the dying West could grow it freely. Wren retained full ownership of the orchard and the original parent stock, and the licensing of the further varieties her grandmother had developed. The crosses Meridian had never had, and the record was corrected formally publicly in language that could not be walked back naming Marlene Calloway as the true originator of the work restoring to a dead woman the name a living man had stolen from her 30 years before. Royce Vance stepped down from the company he had founded within the year. The visionary founder quietly retired. The official statement cited his desire to spend more time away from public life. Everyone who needed to know knew. It was not a Hollywood ending. There was no thunderous courtroom, no gavel, no crowd on its feet. There was a long conference table in a regional city, and a stack of signatures and an old lawyer carefully checking every page through his wire-rimmed glasses to make sure that this time, nothing got lost on the way to where it was supposed to go. The orchard did not come back overnight. Wren had thought somewhere in the back of her mind that winning would make the trees green. It didn't work like that. Spring came and the work began, and it was hard, slow, unglamorous work. Not every tree had survived the long years of neglect. Whole rows had to be pulled out and replanted from the preserved parent stock down in the cellar. The strongest of Marlene's sleepers brought up into the light at last. Earl Tate, the old farmer from down the road, who had known her grandmother, and had quietly started showing up that winter with a truck full of fence wire, and 40 years of know-how taught Wren the things you can't learn from a notebook. Irrigation timing, soil, the feel of when a tree is ready, and when it is only pretending. Hands in the dirt, sun on the back of the neck. The old way. Cordelia stayed too. She ran the field trials with the precision of 30 years in a laboratory, and slowly the dead orchard became again what it had been built to be. A place where something was being made. And then, one morning in late April, Wren walked out onto the porch with a cup of coffee in her hand, and she stopped. The southern row had bloomed. Not everywhere, not all of it, not perfectly. But along the strongest of the trees, the ones planted from Marlene's own hand more than 20 years before, white blossoms had opened in the morning light. And the air, the dry, dead air that had smelled of dust and decay for as long as Wren had been here, carried something else now. Faint, clean, sweet. Apple blossoms. She stood there and breathed it in, and she was 6 years old again. Grass to her knees and sunlight coming gold through thick green leaves and a pair of rough, warm hands lifting her up onto a hip. And she understood finally that she had not imagined it. It had been real. All of it had been real. The smell and the green and the safety and the love. It had been real the whole time, and the woman she'd spent 12 years learning to hate had spent those same 12 years down in the dark, making sure that one day Wren would stand right here and smell it again. The wind moved through the orchard. It did not sound hollow anymore. Briggs drove out that afternoon. He stood beside her at the edge of the field in his old coat, his hands in his pockets looking at the white blossoms along the southern row, and for a long while neither of them said anything. "She'd be proud," he said finally. His voice was rough. "Of you. Of all of it." Wren nodded. She couldn't speak for a moment. For 12 years she had carried a story about herself, and the story had been a lie. She had believed she was the girl nobody fought for, the girl who'd been signed away, handed off left on a porch, and driven down a road and forgotten. She had built her whole self around that wound, had used it for armor, had let it make her hard and wary and alone, because if you never expect anyone to come back for you, then it can't hurt you when they don't. But somebody had fought for her the whole time, harder than anyone had ever fought for anything. Not by holding on, which would have been the easy thing, the selfish thing, but by letting go and then spending every remaining day of her life building a future for a child she would never see again, alone in the dark, asking nothing, expecting no thanks, knowing she would not live to see it bloom. Sometimes love is the thing that stays. And sometimes Wren understood now, standing in the sweet spring air her grandmother had bought her, with a lifetime of stubborn, secret, lonely work. Love is the thing that lets go so that someone else can live. The orchard wasn't just land anymore. It wasn't even just a victory. It was proof. Proof that the thing everyone said was dead had only been sleeping. Proof that what's done patiently in the dark beneath the surface where no one can see it, and no one gives you credit for it, can outlast all the loud and powerful things above the ground. Proof that resilience can outlast neglect, and that the truth buried deep enough and guarded long enough will keep and will one day come up into the light and bloom. Wren stayed out there until the sun went down, walking the rows the way she did every evening now. Only now she wasn't checking for damage. She was just walking among the trees her grandmother grew in the orchard. Her grandmother left her on the land that was against everything, against everyone, finally and truly, and only hers. And the trees stood all around her in the last of the gold light, the old ones blooming and the new ones reaching up out of the same stubborn dirt. And the air was sweet. And somewhere underneath it all, deep down, where the roots went, something that had been alive the whole time, went on quietly living.